Hello and welcome to another video. This is Gina from McGuire. So I've done many videos showing some of the fun things that you can do with Tim Holtz alcohol inks. Well, today I'm sharing a technique I haven't done in a while, but one I always enjoyed teaching when I used to go to stores doing stamping classes. Now this technique, instead of using alcohol inks on Yupo paper or glossy cardstock, I'm using them on watercolor paper, and the results are completely different. I'm also going to add some heat embossing for a bit of a resist. So stick with me here and I'll show you many different examples so that you too can get more out of your alcohol inks. I'll be first showing you how to make a bunch of backgrounds and then we'll turn them into cards. For several of my cards, I'm using this honeybee floral stamp set. Now it's supposed to be kind of a winter floral, but I think you could use this all year round. And a few of my cards today are winterish and a few aren't, so I really think you can stretch this one. I'm using Tim Holtz watercolor paper for today's techniques, but I'll talk about some other options you can use later in this video. I've used my anti-static powder tool on the paper since we're doing heat embossing. And I'm stamping one of those floral images with VersaMark ink. I'm using my MISTI stamping tool, but you could use an acrylic block if you want. I just find this easier. Once I've stamped the image, I'm adding Hero Art's white embossing powder to the image, and I'll let my heat gun get good and hot, then bring it to the paper to melt the powder. This will give a white on white look that'll be difficult to see. Okay, so now I'm going to repeat the process to cover more of the background. I went ahead and created a few different stamped backgrounds using the set. In every case, I did the white embossing on the white watercolor paper. I also wanted to create a few backgrounds using this new stencil from Honeybee Stamps. I think this stencil is so cool, so I thought I'd use heat embossing with it. So I have Tim Holtz watercolor paper. I'm taping it to the back of the stencil, and I'm pressing my VersaMark ink pad directly over the stencil. Once I've covered the entire area, I'll remove the stencil, add white embossing powder, and heat set it. This is another fun way to use stencils for heat embossing. I'm doing white on white, but you could definitely use any kind of embossing powder here that you want. Now you won't be able to see this much until I tilt it in the light, and then you will see the shine of the embossing against the watercolor paper. I also wanted to show the look of alcohol inks on other types of embossing powder other than white. So in this case, I'm using silver embossing powder. So this technique can be used with a variety of stamps or stencils, a variety of embossing powders, and then we just add alcohol ink on top. So I've created a bunch of backgrounds. I'm going to show you what happens when we put the alcohol ink on top. Then we'll make cards. I'm using Tim Holtz alcohol inks along with the blending solution, which is that big bottle, and the Mixatives. These are the metallic products. You want to shake these up real good. And they are great with alcohol inks, but they react a little bit differently than the colored alcohol inks. So I'll show you that. I also have the Tim Holtz alcohol ink applicator tool. This is like the mini blending tool. However, you use pieces of felt for it instead of foam. I'm applying a few different colors of alcohol ink right onto the felt, and I'm putting more ink down than I normally do. When I use any kind of non-porous surface like Yupo paper or glossy accents, I use a lot less alcohol ink. But we're using a porous surface, which is watercolor paper, so we want to make sure to put down more ink. Now I'm going to freeze frame here. I wanted to mention a few things. I have two pieces of paper on my table here. The top one is Yupo paper, which I normally use for alcohol inks. The bottom one is our watercolor paper with the embossing on it. I have the Yupo paper there so you can see a comparison of how the alcohol inks work on Yupo paper and how they work on watercolor paper. When I apply the inks to watercolor paper, they immediately absorb. They don't move around as much. The color absorbs in and you get a beautiful look also. But you can't move them a whole lot once they're on it. But it gives like this deep, rich look that's beautiful. I'm using more color and more blending solution than I would on the Yupo paper, as I mentioned, because the paper's absorbing it. But it's also equally as beautiful as doing this on glossy paper or Yupo paper. Now I'm adding here some silver mixative. This is a product that's meant to go with alcohol inks. When you use it on Yupo paper, it moves around like the color does. But when you use it on the watercolor paper, it kind of sits on top of the paper, so it makes it even more shiny. So you can see I've got like an underlayer of color, and now I'm putting that shiny silver on top. You want to use less of the mixative on the watercolor paper since it sits on top. Now I decided to kind of blend that all, so I put some blending solution on the applicator and just kind of swiped back and forth. And when I let that dry, I end up with some gorgeous shine. You can build up more color if you want to, but really you're not going to be able to move it around a whole lot on the watercolor paper. It's just a deeper, richer look than you get on glossy surfaces like Yupo, but it's another option for using these products, and I just love the results. If you are new to alcohol inks, please check out my video that I've linked here on the top right. It shows how to use them on glossy cardstocks and Yupo paper and the fun that you can have with them. This is just another option. Now here's a comparison, and you can see the difference you get. It's like a rich matte look that you get on the watercolor paper, but that shine sits on top and really kind of takes over the background. I used quite a bit of silver on this one, and I'll use less on my future examples so you can get a comparison. But this is fun because it actually looks a little bit different depending on how you tilt it in the light. And you can see the white heat embossing somewhat resists that ink, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. So let's do another example. I have watercolor paper here with a white heat embossed floral image, and I'm adding some purple and pink alcohol inks. I'm putting down some silver mixative. I used quite a bit there again, and some blending solution. And I'm just going to pounce and twist this around our background. You can see the beautiful look we get. However, when I do it this way, I use so much silver mixative that you can't see the embossing. And I was a little bummed about that. I was going to give up at this point because I got a little carried away with the silver. However, you can always save these backgrounds. What I decided to do was put some blending solution. Blending solution kind of erases or moves the ink. And I put that on my felt applicator and just swiped it back and forth on top, and it removes some of that silver mixative that was sitting on top. And it also removed some of the color from the white heat embossed image. Because think about it, that white heat embossed image is kind of glossy. So the ink acts on that kind of like it does on Yupo, but it absorbs all around it into that watercolor paper. So we are kind of resisting some of that ink we put on top and can remove a bit of it from the embossing with that blending solution. There you can see the beautiful shimmer we're left with and the deep color. Okay, I'm going to do another example here. Again, I have watercolor paper with a white heat embossed image on top. I'm going to start this time with no mixative and just go back and forth, and look how beautiful that is, simply like that. It does color our white embossing a little bit, but not too much. Now I'm taking a tiny bit of silver, swiping back and forth just a tiny bit, very lightly, to add in some of that silver. Now I did have some heavy areas of silver here, so I decided to put some blending solution on, go back and forth, and I end up with a result that I love. There are so many ways to apply this alcohol ink onto the watercolor paper, but keep in mind it's going to absorb into the paper right away and stay put. You can use regular cardstock for this technique and do the white heat embossing on that and then apply the alcohol ink. However, I like using watercolor paper since watercolor paper can take more liquid, and that's really what we're applying onto this. So you can try it with cardstock, but I do recommend watercolor paper. Okay, so this time I'm putting all of my color onto my applicator at first. Started with a little bit of gold mixative, adding a few different greens. I have a watercolor piece with some holly heat embossed on it. And now I'm just swiping back and forth. This could quite possibly be the fastest background ever made because all I'm doing is swiping that color back and forth. And while I have all of that ink on the applicator, I could do a few backgrounds at once. In this case, you can see that touch of gold in the background and how the embossing somewhat resists that alcohol ink that we put on top, but allows a little bit of the color to stay. By applying the alcohol ink with that side-to-side motion, we're actually moving the alcohol ink on the surface of the heat embossing, so it kind of allows it to show more. So let's do my favorite example of all of them. Now this, I have that stenciled and pattern white heat embossed on the watercolor paper. I'm taking a few different colors of green alcohol ink and putting that onto my little applicator along with some blending solution. Now I'm just going to kind of pounce and twist this around my background. Now since this stenciled background had a lot of solid area, you'll see our pattern more. See how those leaves are solid? Those leaves are embossed, heat embossed. They're basically glossy, non-porous shapes. And then around it is the watercolor paper, which is porous. So around those leaves, we have the color absorbing in. And on those leaves, the color's kind of sitting on top so we can kind of move it around as if we were using Yupo paper. I added some gold mixative and I'm kind of dabbing that on too. And check out the fun results. I just love this. It's even better when it dries. So what this shows is that if you use a stamped image or a stencil with a lot of large solid areas, you can see the pattern more. I didn't have to wipe away any of the excess alcohol ink from on top of the embossing. Instead, I left it there and it created this beautiful look. Now this doesn't take long to dry. You could spray it with a fixative if you wanted to. I actually didn't and it seemed to be fine. Now one last example, this is the watercolor paper with the silver embossing. And this I think gives a fun kind of patina look. So I started by just putting some blues onto it, took some blending solution to kind of swipe back and forth, just so you can see the different things that happen as you add the inks. I decided to add some more dark color and a little silver mixative on top, kind of pounce that around. Now this gives a different look. You don't see the leaves as much because it was silver behind it instead of white, but I'm really happy with the results as I add different colors to it. It has more of a muted look because we have the silver under there instead of white, but it's a gorgeous patina, kind of looks aged. It's just beautiful in real life. So I encourage you to try different embossing powders that you have, different stamps and stencils you have, and create a bunch of alcohol ink backgrounds onto watercolor paper. It really is a deep, rich result. Now, sometimes when you create these kind of backgrounds, the results aren't really impressive at first until you trim it down and make it into something. So I'm trimming all of these backgrounds down. Now, I'm always trying to come up with new ways to use backgrounds on cards instead of just as a basic background. So my examples today show you a few different options that you can do. So let's start with the first example where I trimmed one of my backgrounds down and added a die cut border to it. So for this one, I'm using the Honey Bee Stamps new threshold die set. So it has these large door or window dies that can create a fun card. It also has the threshold that you can add to the top or the bottom, whatever you want, a little mail slot, a door handle, a wreath that you can put on it to decorate. It's a really fun die set, and I hope to use it for a few holiday cards. However, today I'm just using the Hello die cut from it, and also these little holly leaves. What I have here are a bunch of holly leaves that I die cut from gold cardstock. And then I glued behind them additional die cuts from white cardstock so they'd have dimension. I then used my stylus to press little lines into the leaves just to give it a little bit of texture and a little bit of fun. So there you can see the results that I have. There's dimension to it thanks to the extra white die cuts I glued behind it. And then we have the impression from the stylus. Now using the Hello die in that threshold die set, I die cut 3 from white cardstock and 1 from gold cardstock, and I glued them together for dimension. You can totally skip adding those stacked die cuts, but I feel like it helps the card to stand out more. You could also use die cut fun foam if you wanted to. So I glued those leaves right along the edge of our inked background, and then I add little pearls for berries. Above that, I added the stacked Hello die cut, and I felt it was best to keep this simple at that. I didn't want to add anything else to it. I felt like the background had enough, along with the gold die cuts. Along the same line, but much faster to put together, is this next card. I put my inked piece towards the bottom of a white note card, and instead of making all those little die cuts, I instead cut 2 thin strips of gold cardstock and adhered it along the top edge. I feel like this gives a nice finished look, but doesn't distract too much from that inked piece that we have. It also ties in nicely with the Hello die cut. This is a design I often do when I create inked backgrounds. Now, I did have a leftover piece from that background, so I created this card. I just used a strip of the inked piece along with 2 thin strips of gold cardstock, and then I added that stacked Hello die cut. By stacking extra white Hello die cuts behind the gold, it makes it stand out more from that background and not get lost. Okay, let's do this purple example next. In this case, I wanted to create a silver string border right across the top of our inked background. By the way, check out the beautiful color that we have on the back of this inked piece. All that alcohol ink absorbs in and you can see it on the other side, and sometimes those results are just as fun. I glued this onto the bottom of a note card, and I wanted to have 3 or 4 lines of silver string right along that top edge. But I didn't want it to be kind of wrapped around randomly. I wanted it to be perfectly lined up. I don't know why. So I decided to add some double-sided tape right on the edges of that top border and right along the top border itself. That way, when I wrap my string around, it'll stay put on that tape. Now I'm using like an elastic silver cording. I wish it weren't elastic, so I'm trying not to stretch it as I do this. But any kind of twine would work, any kind of string, ribbon, whatever you want. I laid down the first edge of it right up against the edge of that purple inked piece. Then I'm just going to keep wrapping it around, each time pressing it into that tape that is exposed, so that I have 3 or 4 beautiful, perfect lines of this string, and it really creates a fun finished border. You could make this as wide as you wanted. I just did a few times, so I was sure to cover all the tape that was exposed. Once I was done, I trimmed the end, and then I put a little dot of Gina K Connect adhesive just to hold that in place, and then I trimmed off the excess. So this will look nice from the inside and from the outside. Next, I'm using more of that silver cording to tie 2 little bows. Nothing fancy, just bows that I can glue behind a die cut and the ends can stick out. Now this is tricky to tie a bow with since it's stretchy, but it works great with twine or any kind of jute that you may have. I have 2 bows here, and I'm putting 2 foam squares above it and 1 below it, and that kind of sandwiches the knots of the bow between. Then I can add my die cut on top of this and it'll hold those bows in place. You can also put a little liquid adhesive in there so they stay put. I have a stacked silver heart die cut that I added along with that hello sentiment. And now I can trim off the excess of the cording. So it looks like we wrapped that string around there and tied it into a bow, but really I carefully wrapped it to get that fun border, and then I added the bows behind the die cuts. I like how the silver really pulls out that silver shimmer that we have in the inked background thanks to the mixative that we used. Okay, my next example is super simple, but one of my favorite designs when I want a card to be simple and keep the focus on a background that I've created. Now in this case, I cut at an angle and glued it to the bottom of a white note card. I then am running liquid adhesive right along the top edge and adding a thin strip of white cardstock that I cut with my trimmer. I then have 2 more thin strips of white cardstock, and I'm going to glue those right above the other, leaving a bit of a space in between. By doing this, I'm just creating a little bit of interest and a finished look along that inked background piece, right along the border. It really makes a big difference in kind of pulling the card together. I'm using my T-ruler to make sure that I'm gluing them down straight and not kind of at an arch. And then I can trim the excess off the edge. So looking at the bottom of this card where we have our inking, the fun part about it is when you tilt it in different directions, you pick up different color or shine. But it does have a beautiful overall shimmer to it. I think that's even more evident with this next example. Now this is the one where I put a lot of the silver mixative on the blue inks. So you can see, depending on how you tilt it in the light, you see something a little different. If you tilt it one way, you see tons of silver. If you tilt it another way, you see more of the deep blues. So you can really control that by how much mixative you use. I kept this design very simple by matting the piece on white cardstock and adding the hello white die cut. Okay, my last two examples are actually a pair of cards that I created out of that one patina-like background. For this, I'm using the Honeybee Be Bold alphabet dies. I'm crazy about this die set because they're tall letters, about 1.5 inches tall, but they're narrow so you can actually fit words onto your card. I have a trick for you on how to get those letters perfect. I have a piece of tape here on my work surface that I've lined up with the grid on my work surface, and the tape is sticky side up. I'm laying the letters of the word thanks down onto it, making sure I have them straight using the grid. Now I'm going to take another piece of tape it right on top of the letters, remove the other piece, and now I have the word thanks all connected and ready to die cut as many times as I want. I'll place this over my inked background and run it through my die cut machine. I'll save the negative space and the letters themselves, and I'll use them on 2 different cards. So after I run it through, here we have our piece, and make sure you keep the dies connected. Okay, so I'm going to use those dies as connected onto a piece of white cardstock that's cut to about the same size. I'll run that through too, and now I can glue this one behind the other for dimension. So here I have the back of my inked piece. I'm putting some liquid adhesive. I'll glue it onto that white piece we just cut, and then I'll trim off anything that's hanging out. So I'm basically just building dimension. I could have done this with a piece of craft foam if I wanted to, but I didn't think about it until after. So I will repeat this process. See those white letter die cuts up at the top right? I'm going to save those for the other card too. I actually did 3 layers of white cardstock, and then I put the patina piece on top. So now on the other card, I have my stacked letters. I glued the white die cuts behind the inked ones, and I have temporarily taped my T-ruler to a white note card to keep a straight line in which I can put my letters up against to make sure that they don't go curvy. I'm putting my letters close together so that I have a little extra space on the right where I can stamp a greeting. So you can see the example on the left where I used the negative space. I die cut 3 layers and glued them together so that it had that dimension to it. I could have skipped that, but that dimension makes a big difference. I then stamped a greeting that says, "I treasure our friendship," onto a thin piece of white cardstock and glued that on top. You can see that beautiful patina look that we get by using that silver embossing powder on watercolor paper and then adding the alcohol inks. By the way, that "I treasure our friendship" is from the Simon Says Stamp Tiny Word Stamp Set, which is one that I've been using a lot. Now the second card has those leftover letters that are stacked and added to the white note card. I stamped "You're So Amazing" from that same Tiny Word Stamp Set. You can see that these letters are wide enough that you can pick up that pattern that we created using our inking. That's why I like to use those, and I was able to create 2 cards out of that one background. So there's a way you can get a new look from your alcohol inks by using them on watercolor paper with heat embossing. I hope you'll give this a try. It really is fun to do. In the middle are a couple other alcohol ink videos that you might like. Please hit subscribe if you haven't done so already. And as always, I'm very thankful that you're here. I hope this was helpful, and we'll see you again soon.